Does truth exist?
Because you have faith, does that make this book true?
Does God exist?
So when someone says there is no truth, if you apply the claim to itself, what should you say? Is that true? They don't think Christianity's true. They're talked out of it. You know why they're talked out of it? Because they've never been talked into it.
Cross-examining skeptical and atheistic views. Welcome to Cross-Examine with Dr. Frank Turek.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know that over about the past decade on this program, I've referenced a book called The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions. The author is Dr. David Berlinski, and I'm privileged to have him as my guest today. Dr. Berlinski is an author, thinker, professor, and he's a self-described secular Jew who, with wit and elegance, as you'll see, dismantles the assumptions and assertions of Darwinists and other atheistic materialists. He does this in his interviews and his books. Dr. Berlinski has his PhD from Princeton University, not far from where I grew up. He's taught at Stanford and Rutgers. He's a fellow with our friends at the Discovery Institute. And as you know, we've had Stephen Meyer on this program several times. So Dr. Berlinski is part of the Discovery Institute. He actually lives in Paris under the shadow of the great Cathedral Notre Dame there. And Dr. Berlinski, let me start by asking you this. First of all, it's a privilege to have you on, but I've seen some kind of crazy plans to convert or to renovate the cathedral there. One of them has a pool on top. Are they expecting mass baptisms or something over there? What's going on over there in Paris?
Well, I think those claims, to a certain extent, one hopes are exaggerated. The French government and the French people reacted with undisguised horror when they were proposed. And of course, they were absolutely right. The plans were grotesque. They were architecturally grotesque. They were theologically grotesque. Nonetheless, a lot of architects thought, hey, they're a great idea. Let's put a pool on the top and make this a community swimming pool for all faiths and all religions. Those plans have been dropped. There was another grotesque plan to replace the spire on the roof with glass instead of the ancient material, solid wood. But it's a kind of episodic outbreak of insanity that we are very familiar with respect to the architectural tradition. These architects go nuts every now and then.
Now, have they made any progress on the renovation so far?
It's very slow. You know, I talked to the guys. I live right next to Notre Dame. So I talked to some of them. I talked to some of the engineers. The problem is the fire was much more devastating than anyone realized at the time. I was right there. I saw the whole structure burn. But, you know, you're dealing with 800-year-old blocks of sandstone, of lime, and nobody knows the damage that was caused on the inside by water much more than fire. So there are real questions about the structural stability of the building, and those questions are not going to be resolved anytime soon. You know, the French President Macron said, well, in 5 years, we'll rebuild the whole structure. Nobody's counting on that anymore. It's going to take 20 years to get that whole thing settled. Well, it was a massive amount of destruction. Just quite incredible.
That's, unfortunately, it kind of parallels the destruction of the faith in France, I believe, over the past.
Everyone saw that immediately. That was the thought that everyone in France had. And I think it was beyond France, too. Everyone had the same thought. What an unpleasantly appropriate symbol.
Now, you have written what I think is my favorite book on atheism and its scientific pretensions. That's your subtitle, but it's so well titled and so well written. This book, The Devil's Delusion, is a book that anyone can read, ladies and gentlemen. And despite the fact it was written in 2008, it is an evergreen book. It's a book you can pick up today, and it's just as fresh as it was written 11 years ago. How did you come about to write this book? It seems to be a response partially to the Dawkins book, The God Delusion. But how did you come about to write this, Dr. Berlinski?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it was a response to the book by Dawkins, but also there was a book by Christopher Hitchens entitled God Was Not Great. And what struck me as curious and what struck me as provocative, certainly, is that this was not simply an expression, an overflow of village atheism. sort of stuff that's been perennial in Western culture for the last 2,000 years. It was different to the extent that it was invoking the authority of the scientific experience to make the claims. And I thought that was particularly egregious and particularly outrageous. The scientific experience does not provide atheism with that kind of authority. And I think you were very kind in saying that the book still has some topical relevance. I think it is to that extent that it is relevant. Because I meet people very regularly with the same impression. Well, science shows. I mean, the prolegomena is always science has shown, science shows, science will show. And the fact of the matter is that questions about the existence of the deity are neither in the premises nor the conclusions of any of the great theories. So you have to be very careful. What exactly does science show? And it turns out it doesn't show very much. It leaves the questions open. And that, as you quite perspicuously noted, was my motivation for writing the book. But I have to admit, it was an exuberant experience. I love taking off after guys like Dawkins or Hitchens or Sam Harris. They're unbelievably tempting targets. I don't know whether you agree or not.
Well, no, I do agree.
They're fat, self-satisfied, smug, just begging to be slapped in the face. So I was happy to oblige.
Well, you did so very well, sir. And in fact, I've had a couple of debates with Christopher Hitchens myself, and I thought that your little essay in the new book that you've written, which comes out on November 19th, ladies and gentlemen, it's called Human Nature by Dr. David Berlinski. And by the way, this is what the Chicago Tribune says about this book. It says, quote, on the very cover, Berlinski puts any topic, Berlinski plus any topic equals an extraordinary book. Well said.
Oh, nice comment. Was that yours or the Chicago Tribune?
That's the Chicago Tribune. It's hard to believe, but that's what they said. That there must be somebody.
I didn't know about that. Hey.
It's right on the cover. No, it's the Chicago Tribune, and of course, the great Victor Davis Hanson says a brilliant indictment of scientific groupthink. That's on the back cover. And this is Dr. Berlinski's new book, Human Nature. But your essay in there on Christopher Hitchens I thought was so insightful. I had a couple of debates with him myself. And as you put out, Hitchens was not really interested in the theological arguments. Despite trying to claim that science has disproven God, when I pressed him a little bit on the evidence for the beginning of the universe, which you cover in The Devil's Delusion, he just said, well, I'm not a physicist. Well, then why is he bringing up arguments related to science then?
I think you're absolutely right. Look, I have to begin any remarks. I liked Christopher Hitchens.
I did too.
I don't know anybody who disliked him. He was an intensely appealing figure. He met a tragic death. He suffered very bravely, and I think he was in many, many respects an admirable human being. At least his capacity for suffering was quite extraordinary, and being improved and made more virtuous through his suffering. But as far as a philosophically acute intelligence or a logically acute intelligence, he knew as well as anyone else, you or I, that he lacked in that department. That was not his strongest suit. He was a polemicist. He was a large, gregarious, bold, and dramatic figure. That was Christopher Hitchens.
Yes, and for me, he was evidence of a divine being because the qualities he exhibited in his rhetoric were just approaching divine. I mean, I'm sitting there, David, in my first debate with him, and he's the first person I ever debated, believe it or not, other than my wife, who annihilates me routinely.
That goes without saying.
Yeah, but he was so good at rhetoric that I'm daydreaming during my first debate. I'm going, I really like this guy. I don't know what he's saying, but it just sounds so good. And he was just brilliant at that.
It didn't hurt that he had a beautiful baritone, beautiful bass.
That's correct.
Voice, and a wonderfully plummy English accent. And people tended to overlook the vacuity of what he very often said. He wasn't driven very hard by his opponents. I have to say that.
No, and I'm looking forward to seeing your debate with him. I didn't realize you had that. We're talking to Dr. David Berlinski. His book that you need to get is called The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and His Scientific Pretensions. It is an enjoyable, elegant read. You will enjoy it. And we're going to get into that book right after the break. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with Frank Turek on the American Family Radio Network. We're back in 2 minutes. Don't go away.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you help me with something? Can you help me get this podcast before more people? Not only tell your friends about it, but go up to iTunes and put a 5-star review on the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. If you do that, it will help us move the podcast up the charts so more people will hear it. Thank you so much for partnering with me on this.
All right, this is from the flap of The Devil's Delusion by my guest today, Dr. David Berlinski. This is written by Dr. Berlinski. Here we go. Has anyone provided a proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have the sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything so long as it's not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism and moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion in the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. That is from Dr. Berlinski's book, The Devil's Delusion. You have a way with words, sir. You were not an English major. You were a philosophy major and a mathematician. How did you get so good at prose?
I wasn't even a philosophy major. I studied medieval history in college.
But don't you have a PhD from Princeton?
I got a PhD.
Yes.
Yeah. But in college, I studied when I was studying anything, which wasn't a whole lot of time devoted to that particular occupation. I spent most of my college years chasing girls and playing pool, but perhaps your listeners shouldn't be entitled to that privileged information.
Well, I noticed in reading Human Nature, another one of your books that I sent, it's going to come out in a couple of weeks here, that you were skeptical of Darwinism back in the 1960s during your days at Princeton. Why did you doubt it then?
Well, it was very interesting. When I was studying logic and philosophy at Princeton, Darwin simply did not appear on anyone's intellectual horizon. The man's name wasn't invoked. The theories weren't discussed. And I spoke with my graduate school roommate, Daniel Messinger, about it. And he said, well, I read on the Origin of Species. And I said, all right, tell me what's inside. And so he told me what's inside. And I said, that's it? That's the complete global explanation for the emergence and diversification of life? He said, yeah, well, that's it. And it was 1964. I said, that couldn't be right. It just couldn't be right. So my doubts were very long-standing, and they were confirmed afterwards. I discovered, much to my surprise, there were a lot of other people who had exactly the same reaction. That just couldn't be right. That doesn't sound like a scientific theory. It's vague. It doesn't really specify much. It doesn't answer the deepest kinds of questions about living system that we very naturally want to present to ourselves. And it was a great pleasure discovering that other people felt the same way. I published a paper in 1973 about what would be needed to make a Darwinian theory somewhat more successful. It was in a paper in automata theory. And this kind of automata is needed, a push-down storage automata, to look forward, to at least anticipate, so that complicated structures could be put together. Without that, you have nothing, either in language or in the establishment of machines. And I published it. The editor was a very, very good philosopher, Sidney Morgenbesser. And he said, well, we'll publish it. It looks interesting enough. Nobody's really interested in Darwin. This was 1973. Nobody's really interested in Darwin. And he said, well, we'll publish it. We'll just stick philosophy in the title. So they called it Philosophical Aspects of Molecular Biology. And then I discovered other people felt the same way. My great friend in Paris, the mathematician 𝗦𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗧, I wrote to him. I sent him my stuff. He wrote back. We got together. And he said, it's just a preposterous idea that we have an explanation in these terms. Of course, he was delighted as a Frenchman to be denying an English theory. That was an additional ancillary pleasure. But by the 1980s, there were a lot of people who were saying the same thing.
But
I
it
claim
wasn't.
pride at first. I was there first.
You were there first, and it didn't come on my radar until 1991 when Philip Johnson wrote Darwin on Trial. And, of course, he just passed on this week. Yes, it is.
That's a good book.
And
Johnson had a terrific influence.
I think he was probably credited with starting the modern ID movement that got Stephen Meyer involved in it and many others. But you write in The Devil's Delusion, I love what you say here. This is page 186. You say, within the English-speaking world, Darwin's theory of evolution remains the only scientific theory to be widely championed by the scientific community and widely disbelieved by everyone else. No matter the effort made by biologists, the thing continues to elicit the same reaction it has always elicited. You've got to be kidding, right? Well, what has happened since 1973 when you started to see holes in the theory? What have we learned since then, Dr. Berlinski, about this theory of macroevolution? What are the other problems with it?
There are lots and lots of problems from my point of view, which is not identical to Steve Meyer's point of view or to the other guys at the Discovery Institute. From my point of view is this. Look, we've got 300 years experience now with theories in physics, and we pretty much understand what a good theory looks like. We've got Newtonian mechanics, we've got Clock-Maxwell electromagnetic field, we've got theories of relativity, we've got quantum mechanics, we've got quantum field theory, we've got the Standard Model. We're not moving in a blind way. We're not entering a dark room. We know what a scientific theory looks like. And knowing this, when we look at what biologists say about macroevolution, we know that just isn't a scientific theory. It's open-ended, it's vague, it makes no precise quantitative predictions. It doesn't have a sound mathematical structure. And I'm not the only one saying this. There's a whole institute at Oxford now devoted to providing the missing mathematical structure for evolutionary theory. Well, if the structure is missing, why the universal sense among biologists that the structure is complete? There's something incoherent, a mark of distinction or divagation between the propaganda effort, which is relentless, and the true state of the theory, which is completely incomplete, incoherent, vague, uncertain, unspecified. That's a remarkable fact, but it's not a fact about science. It's a fact about sociology.
Now, you have spoken in your another book that I have right here on my desk called The Deniable Darwin, which is about 500 pages on Darwinism and the problems with it. Tell our listeners a little bit about the Cambrian explosion and the problems this creates for Darwinists today.
It's one example, but it's by no means the only example. Look, 500 million years ago, you look all the way into the remote past, and what do you see? You see a lot of weirdo things floating around in the ocean, the so-called Ediacaran flora and fauna. And they're truly bizarre creatures. And then in a relatively short amount of time, say between 10 and 40 million years ago, there's a tremendous efflorescence, a burst of living systems, including the ancestors for almost all of the modern metazoan flora and fauna. And where the information came from, where the organizing principles came from for this Cambrian explosion remains profoundly enigmatic, because these are creatures with no obvious predecessors. We can't find the predecessors, and we've looked. It's not as if we have failed to look diligently enough. No. The looking has been very effective. We've exhaustively scrubbed the likely sites. And as far as we can tell, for the greater part of the Cambrian, we are dealing with the sudden emergence, de novo emergence of new life forms. That's kind of surprising. Surprising under several different assumptions. For one thing, Darwinian theory makes a very firm assumption and prediction that life is a matter of a continuously expanding proliferation of new forms. Continuous suggests there are always going to be intermediates, and with respect to the Cambrian, we can't find those intermediates. That is a signal, an important signal, that requires a kind of decisive explanation before anything about Darwinian theory can be accepted on its face. And the Cambrian is not the only example. There are very, very many examples throughout the fossil record where there seems to be exhibited in the record itself a radical form of discontinuity with something entirely new appearing on the one end and inadequate forebears on the other hand. This failure of continuity has always struck me as the key ingredient in a scientific critique of Darwinian evolution. Bear in mind, it's not the only time we've seen something like this. At the end of the 19th century, physics, Newtonian physics, which is built on the axiom of continuity because all the functions are differentiable, encountered sharply discontinuous phenomena in quantum theory. Couldn't explain it. We needed a revolution to accommodate the discontinuities. It seems to be a form of scientific heresy to say as much in biology. Maybe that's changing a little. Maybe that's changing just a bit. But until the last 5 or 6 years to say, well, look, exactly the same deeply singular evidence that we saw at the end of the 19th century in physics seems to be a feature of biology itself, immediately evokes the suspicion that in the very next moment, I'm going to advocate handling snakes. It's not true. This is a scientific argument.
Well, I must...
Speaking in tongues, which always attracted me. That's what the French always say when I start speaking French. Come on.
Well, I saw you interviewed somewhere, and I can't remember exactly where it was now, but it might actually be in the back of the Human Nature book, your new book, but... the indignation that the Darwinists immediately vomit out if you criticize, I don't mean just you, but anybody who criticizes Darwinism, seems to me that they're protesting too much. And you point out that if you're a Christian, they're going to call you a liar for Jesus. Now, they can't call you that because you're not a Christian, but they call you other names rather than dealing with your arguments. I'm going to ask you to be a bit of a psychologist in the last minute we have here in this segment, Dr. Berlinski. Why are they doing this? Why are they so indignant?
Well, let's take two of the things that all men prize. One is money, the other is prestige. A stern advocacy in favor of Darwin's theory of evolution has, tradition suggests, led both to money and prestige. If someone is criticizing the theory, there's an implicit threat that both are going to be withdrawn, or if not withdrawn, then at least tempered to a certain extent. So the counter-reaction is not unexpected. It's not. Nobody likes to be criticized. I'm including myself. I immediately form a suspicious conjecture about anyone who criticizes me. And if I had the choice, I would abuse him too, or her. Fortunately, I'm not usually given the choice.
We're talking to Dr. David Berlinski. He has several fabulous books. The Devil's Delusion is one. The Deniable Darwin is another. And the new one coming out in about 8 days is called Human Nature. The name is spelled Berlinski. You need to avail yourselves of these works, especially my favorite, The Devil's Delusion. I'm Frank Turek. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. We've got 2 more segments with Dr. Berlinski, so don't go away. Back in 2.
If you find value in the content of this podcast, don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Join our online community to have great conversations, grow in your knowledge of God, and become a better defender of the Christian faith. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we have hundreds of videos and over 100,000 subscribers that are part of our online family. Find us by searching for Frank Turek or Cross-Examine in the search bar. You can find many more resources like articles, online courses, free downloadable materials, event calendars, and more at crossexamined.org.
Welcome back to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with Frank Turek. My guest, Dr. David Berlinski, author of The Devil's Delusion, The Deniable Darwin, and Human Nature, among other books. Before we get back to Dr. Berlinski, I want to mention I'll be at the University of Maine in Orono, that's up near Bangor, this Wednesday night for I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. That's November 13th, I believe. Check our website, crossexamine.org, for events. As always, any college event is always free to the general public. There'll be time for Q&A. So come out to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist this Wednesday night if you're a maniac, if you live up in Maine. Okay, back to my guest, Dr. David Berlinski. Dr. Berlinski, before the break, we were talking about some of the motivations that people might have for getting a little bit annoyed if you criticize the theory of Darwinism. Seemed to me, you had mentioned money and prestige. There's another category that I think our friend Christopher Hitchens made quite clear with regard to the issue of sex. He didn't want God to exist, and he thought maybe suggesting that he does exist and that maybe macroevolution wasn't true would be to give in to a cosmic North Korean dictator, which, by the way, is great imagery if you're an atheist. I like the way Hitchens did that. But it seems to me there are other motivations as well. That people, in fact, you write, I want to say this is in The Devil's Delusion. You write, let me find this quote because it's very, very telling. What did I do with it? You write about assumptions. Here you say, arguments follow from assumptions, and assumptions follow from beliefs, and very rarely, perhaps never, do beliefs reflect an agenda determined entirely by the facts. Unpack that further, sir.
Well, I think the way we form beliefs is still in the 21st century rather mysterious. We don't really understand how human beings come to the beliefs that we hold. It's certainly not driven by the evidence. Let's put that myth aside. Nobody is driven by the evidence to form the beliefs that they do or have. And the evidence isn't irrelevant. It's just not probative or determinative. Bishop Berkeley has an interesting point. He says that the only thing that can influence a belief is another belief. He had a particular philosophy of mind in view. He thought the mind was the only real thing that existed in the universe. But the observation is quite distinct, that we're influenced in a way that we have never successfully described by our other beliefs, and it is kind of a closed circle of beliefs influencing beliefs. Where it meets the real world, where the real world penetrates our system, it's not entirely clear. It's very hard to make that case. You'll certainly notice, you yourself, I gather, are something of a polemicist, or at least you participate in the debate. The number of times where somebody comes up to you after a discussion and says, as opposed to, I found your talks interesting, everybody will say that as a gesture of politeness. But very rarely will they say, I've changed my mind, or your views have provoked me to change my mind. That doesn't happen a lot. So we're dealing with a situation antecedently in which many, many positions are frozen. And all that you can really hope to do is take a hammer and give the ice of self-possession a good sharp thwack. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't help. But anybody who participates in public debate knows as much that beliefs are very sturdy creatures. They're very resistant to change.
Well said. You remind me of Philip Johnson's use of the wedge, penetrating the petrified wood of naturalism.
Listen, excuse me for interrupting you. It's an interesting talk. You know, years and years and years ago, I worked at McKinsey as a management consultant. And I came across an essay by one of the senior partners, extremely smart guy, very, very impressive. Carter Bales was his name. And he said, how do we get something done? He was talking about working in a bureaucracy. And he says, you can't take a chisel, you can't take a hammer, you can't take a saw. What you have to use is a plane, and you have to be extremely patient, and you have to plane that wood and then sandpaper it and sandpaper it and sandpaper it. And you have to be prepared to accept small changes. I thought that was a very wise declaration. I think in philosophy and theology and modern scientific polemics, you have to be prepared to accept small changes. Things change incrementally. They don't change dramatically, unless it's one of those rare cases in physics where a decisive experiment or a magnificent theory appears. I mean, everything changed in 1905 with special relativity because everybody could understand it was right. But that's the exception. For most of the time, things change in a small way.
In fact, you have written, I believe it's in the Human Nature, that ideologies change around the edges. They do not cave in the center. So
I think that's true.
Yeah, it does take a while for minds to change. And I think they are changing in the realm of Darwinism because, as you well know, the Royal Society had the conference in November of 2016 looking for a new theory of macroevolution. Did you happen to attend that?
No, was that the one in London?
It was, yes, sir. And then Stephen Meyer and Doug Axe went, and I guess a few other folks from the Discovery Institute.
Yeah, I think I was invited, but decided I was just too inconvenienced to cross the I don't like leaving my apartment in general.
Well, you're in the United States now, and for our listeners, look for Dr. Berlinski on the Ben Shapiro show because he's about to record an interview with Ben Shapiro. And, you know, Ben is a wonderful interviewer. He knows the issues surrounding intelligent design and macroevolution because he demonstrated that quite well in his interview with Stephen Meyer, a colleague of Dr. Berlinski. So, listeners, look out for the interview with Dr. Berlinski, which I assume will come out in the next few weeks because that's why he's in the United States right now.
I've made a secret vow to lapse into sullen irrelevance tomorrow and refuse to answer a single question. I don't know.
Please. I think you're incapable of doing that, sir. So I've seen enough interviews with you. Tough. Yes, I've seen
I had a wonderful professor of philosophy who had mastered that. This was in the old days when you can get away with it. His name was John Herman Randall Jr. Mm-hmm. And I remember somebody asked a question. He always came to class smoking a huge cigar. He puffed on his cigar for about 5 minutes, and then he gave what I thought was one of the great answers in all of pedagogic history. He said, "That's a stupid question."
There are stupid questions. Now, let me ask you this question. First of all, I know everybody who's listening right now is going to want me to ask Dr. Berlinski what his religious beliefs are. I'm not going to ask him that. And I'll tell you why. Because he's asked the same question in his book, Human Nature, and I want you to get that book. So in the back of the book, there is a interview that he does, and you can see his answer there. So let's just leave it at that. But I do want to ask you this, Dr. Berlinski. If you suggest that maybe there's an intelligent designer out there, given the evidence we see for intelligence, how do you deal with the so-called God of the Gaps fallacy when atheists or Darwinists will say, Dr. Berlinski, first of all, you're not a biologist, and secondly, you're committing the God of the Gaps fallacy? How do you respond?
Yeah, okay. And what's next? I mean, the God of the Gaps fallacy has entered into the English language as a discussion stopper. It's like a door stopper. You put it under the door in the hope the door is going to stop swinging. The fact of the matter is, wherever you look at the gaps, I mean, imagine the number line, which is filled with a lot of little gaps. Wherever you really look, the gaps aren't getting smaller. They're getting more numerous and they're getting larger. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that that argument points to a real fallacy, I don't see the fallacy there. If you say God did it, that's one explanation. It may be a good explanation, a bad explanation, but it's not a fallacy. Nothing fallacious is being advocated. To the extent that argument is invoked, the counter response is, well, a lot of gaps. We need a big fella to deal with them.
That's right. And I think some of the arguments that you've made and Stephen Meyer has made and others, Doug Axe, the folks at the Discovery Institute, when you're arguing it's possible there's an intelligent designer out there, you're not arguing from what you don't know. You're arguing from what you do know. And you've pointed out in the Deniable Darwin that Paley's argument is still good, that a watch implies a watchmaker. When you find a watch, you don't say, well, I just lack an extra explanation. You go, there's got to be a watchmaker out there. And there appears to be, anyway, so many aspects of biology, not to mention physics and other areas, that appear to require an intelligent cause. There's intelligence, there's agency in there. You've made that case in several ways in Deniable Darwin and The Devil's Delusion. So, friends, you need to get those books. Let me ask you this, too. You also say this. You point out that the hypothesis that we're nothing more than cosmic accidents has been widely accepted by the scientific community. And you mentioned that Richard Dawkins, Bertrand Russell, Steven Weinberg, others, they have this belief as an article of their faith. Now, why do you use the word faith there?
They revel in this belief. They can't get enough of self-abuse. But there is a wonderful new phrase that's entered the English language. It's called humble brag. And I think it perfectly describes this. Dr. Johnson had a wonderfully witty way of putting it. He said, "You can depend on it, sir, that every form of self-criticism is obliquely a form of self-praise. It shows that you have something to spare." I think that's exactly what Bertrand Russell and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens are all doing. They're covering themselves ignominiously with the blanket of their own insignificance. But if they really meant that, they would not be covering themselves so flamboyantly. They mean that they're pretty special anyway, even if they are of very little cosmic significance. But the whole thing is rhetorically an exercise in any number of dissimulations. It's not meant seriously. It's not meant seriously.
Well, the issue here, though, for them, let's go back to Einstein's question: why is the universe so comprehensible? Why is it comprehensible? Why could we even do science?
It's a good question, and I have no idea why it's so, but it is so to a certain extent. The fact that we have magnificent scientific theories, and I would add magnificent mathematical theories as well, is a great gift, but it's an unexplained gift. I mean, after all, if you look at other species, dogs are in their own way quite intelligent animals. They get by very, very well, or lions or moose, whatever you want to. But this particular aspect of cognition, this particular acquaintanceship with the universe, is not a feature of the dog's mind, but it is a feature of ours. And we don't quite understand why it's there and what good it does. It certainly has nothing to do with survival. In fact, it may lead to the opposite. Given the existence of nuclear weapons, it may lead precisely to the extinction of the human race. Nonetheless, we have an unearthly capacity to form these profound, these deep, these rich, these intricate scientific theories. And they're just gifts.
And gifts imply a gift giver in my mind anyway. We're talking to the great Dr. David Berlinski. His book, The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions. Also, The Deniable Darwin, another book Dr. Berlinski has written, and the brand new book, Human Nature. You would benefit from all of them. I highly recommend you get them. I'm Frank Turk. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist in American Family Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist is a listener-supported radio program and podcast. If you like what we do, would you please consider going to crossexamined.org and giving us a tax-deductible donation? 100% of your donations will go to ministry, 0% to buildings. Thanks so much.
In addition to the University of Maine, this Wednesday, next week, I'll be in McAlester, Oklahoma, Sunday all day. You can check out the website for more, crossexamined.org. Click on events. You'll see Frank Turk calendar. Go there. Talking to David Berlinski, in addition to his books, he's got some articles up on the Discovery Institute. And Dr. Berlinski, I see this article you co-wrote with Brian Miller and 𝗦𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗧 in a response to Jerry Coyne. What is that about?
Well, Jerry Coyne is professor emeritus. He was an evolutionary biologist. He wrote an interesting book about speciation. And he published a critique of a video that appeared, I think 3-4 months ago, in which certain claims were made. And he thought he would publish a very authoritative critique and talk about the Cambrian explosion with an insider's keen point of view. And 𝗦𝗘𝗏𝗏𝗧, who is a world-famous paleontologist, Brian Miller, who's a first-rate physicist, and we all put together a response, which was published, interestingly enough, on 𝗦𝗏𝗏𝗧, which does not usually publish these kind of responses, but it was published on 𝗦𝗏𝗏𝗧, and it was very authoritative, and it was very detailed. It was certainly not a piece of rhetorical abuse. It was just a dispassionate analysis of the kind of claims that an evolutionary or former evolutionary biologist was wont to make about certain issues. And it was very satisfying to get that out, because I think people reading it, at least I hope people reading it, would have the sense that the diapason is changing. There are different arguments now on the table. And it's been a long time, and people have been arguing in this way at least since 1859. But there is a certain amount, a certain appreciation within the biological community, no matter how indignantly they'll deny any association with me or the Discovery Institute, that certain issues need to be resolved before anyone can claim that biology is a science that is, in all respects, rather like theoretical physics. It's nothing like theoretical physics. So I think that was a good thing. I was very pleased and proud to be associated with 𝗦𝗘𝗗𝗦𝗢𝗧 and Brian Miller.
And though that article can be seen on the Discovery Institute website, ladies and gentlemen, so go to discovery.org and then search for Berlinski, and you'll find that article as well as many others. And as we've said many times on this program before, ladies and gentlemen, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. All data needs to be gathered, all data needs to be interpreted, and you'll see when you read this article that when you look at the data, you have to decide whose interpretation makes more sense. And I think if you're reasonable, you'll see that Dr. Berlinski's interpretation of the data, along with Miller and 𝗦𝗪𝗧, makes a lot more sense than what Jerry Coyne is saying, but you have to read the article to see.
No decision is required. We're right, they're wrong. That's all.
That's right, that's right. What am I thinking, Dr. Berlinski? Of course.
Take it from me. Take it from me.
It's correct. Now, some internet atheists, they're really fond right now of making the silly claim that atheism is just a lack of belief in God. But you point out that atheism makes many assertions about reality. In fact, you say that atheism is an ideology. Can you unpack that for us?
Atheism is an ideology. I think you have a vulgar way of capturing that, and something more sophisticated. Atheism is an ideology. It's a way of presenting yourself, and it offers a kind of snapshot appraisal of your character. If you say, I am an atheist, usually it's between the ages of 10 and 27. It means you're defiant, rebellious, unwilling to truckle to authority, completely convinced of your own assured place in the universe, and unwilling, like so many soldiers in the trenches, to encounter religious experience only as a matter of unpleasant contingency. But that disappears very quickly, and it's very vulgar. V.S. Naipaul, the great English writer, had a somewhat different perspective on exactly that question. He said, well, I find the idea of participating in religious life completely unacceptable. Alien, in fact. And nobody asked him, well, why is that? I was always tempted, but of course I didn't know V.S. Naipaul. I don't know if I would have had the nerve to pose the question in just those terms, but it is an interesting question. Why? Very often sensitive, intelligent, well-read people find that any participation in a religious life or any attempt to capture a religious experience is profoundly troubling to their self-image, because I think that's what's really at issue. To be a religious man or woman in the 21st century or even the late 20th century within the Western world is to disassociate yourself from prevailing ways of self-presentation. And that comes at a price. That does come at a price. It's quite different in the Muslim community. Bear in mind.
Yes, it is.
This is not a universal part of experience. And that is one reason that the Muslim community appears so overwhelmingly threatening to Western liberals. Because here are a billion people who take their religious devotions very seriously. And nobody knows quite how to deal with it. It's an aspect of contemporary life that's fraught. Might as well just say it. It is fraught.
Last time I was in Paris, I ventured into a neighborhood, and I've only been there once, unfortunately, but it seemed like I was in Saudi Arabia.
Where were you?
I don't know. I was lost. So
probably near Stalingrad.
Yes, and you live there.
No, not that neighborhood.
No, but you live in Paris, and are there two different Parises, if you will?
No, not really. I mean, there's some Paris, as you know, is divided into arrondissements. There's some arrondissements that if you're smart, you won't walk around at 3 o'clock in the morning. If you're smart. But they're not dangerous in the way that, say, a New York neighborhood could be dangerous, or a Los Angeles or San Francisco neighborhood could be dangerous. They're just sullen and seedy. There's quite a bit of vagrancy, quite a bit of homelessness, people sleeping on the street. And if you're a woman dressed inappropriately, you can expect a certain amount of harassment. There's no question about that. But I would say only 2 or 3 arrondissements in Paris are like that. Certainly nothing like that in mine, which is the 4th. Quite different. So it depends where you go.
I just
like
saw
any other city.
I just saw today that the French police, not to go too much off on a tangent, though, have cleaned out a number of the shanty towns underneath the highways and freeways. Oh, they do? Okay.
They call in the newspapers, they call in the photographers, they clean it out, and a week later they're all back.
Let me ask you one more thing. We only got about 4 minutes to go, but I found a wonderful essay in your new book, Human Nature, about Peter Abelard, the 11th century philosopher and logician. He got involved in an illicit relationship, which you describe, and he was made to choose between his head and his heart, basically. Can you share with our audience the conflict that Abelard had? And in fact, you point out it's a conflict that we all have. We have a conflict between logic and love.
Abelard, actually, the building where they consummated their affair, Abelard and Eloise, the young woman, is maybe 50 feet from my own building. And the stones are still there. The old structure is still there. There's a sign. Abelard was an extremely clever logician. He came to prominence around 1110 or 1115. And he was a man in his 30s. He had taken orders, of course, and he was widely known to be insufferable because his victims were outraged at his cleverness. And he was walking along the quay one day, which I can see from my window. He met a beautiful young woman. Not clear how old she was, anywhere from 15 to 22. And he was immediately smitten. She lived in a building adjacent, and he became her tutor. Oddly enough, immediately promoted himself from logician to lover. They carried on a torrid affair. They were discovered, and her uncle put together a dreadful plot to humiliate Abelard by castrating him. It was successfully accomplished. He was devastated. Eloise was sent to a nunnery, much against her will. She spent the rest of her life lamenting the loss of the love that she cherished to that extent, to an extraordinary extent. And she has some prayers, deeply moving prayers, where she said, even if it meant the loss of my soul in paradise, I wouldn't give up the love that I bore toward Abelard. And Abelard's life was shattered and broken, of course, as you can imagine. And you can see very vividly in this famous 12th century love affair the deep conflict between the longing for purity in every human being, which is expressed by logic, and the joy and exuberance of carnal relationships and loving carnal relationships, which is expressed in the affair that was doomed from the first, as all loving relationships are doomed from the first, simply in virtue of being loving relationships among human beings. And it's very poignant, and it's not resolved, and it is a tension, and it is there, and these are the facts of life as we have to bear them. Enjoy them or endure them.
Well, it just struck me that all of us know there are things we should do, and yet there are things that we would love to do that we shouldn't do. And it's a tension. It's a continual tension and a continual conflict. And as what Christians try and say is that we try and resist our idols and try and put Christ at the top, and we don't always do that. We fail.
Not easy, but if you do anything else, do read the letters between Abelard and Eloise. They're among the imperishable masterpieces.
Are they?
Hers especially.
Well, Dr. Berlinski, it's been a great pleasure having you on. We're about out of time, but I just want to thank you for your work. The Devil's Delusion is one of my favorite books on atheism. And the new books, Deniable Darwin, 2010, and the brand new book, Human Nature, are also wonderful reads. So, Dr. Berlinski, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to look for you on the Ben Shapiro Show. Thank you so much, sir.
So much. Take care.
That's Dr. David Berlinski. Again, you can find more about him at the Discovery Institute. Go to discovery.org. And again, his books, The Devil's Delusion, which should be the first book you get. Get that book, read that. You will enjoy it. It is well written, elegantly written. A lot of wit, a lot of sarcasm, a lot of laughs, and a lot of great insights. So check it out. Don't forget, friends, I'm at University of Maine this Wednesday for I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And then this coming Sunday, next Sunday, I'll be in McAlester, Oklahoma. Check our website, crossexamine.org, for more. See you next week. God bless.
If you benefit from this podcast, help others find it. Just go to iTunes or any other podcast service you might be using to listen and leave us a 5-star rating on the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast with Dr. Frank Turek. It will take you less than 5 seconds. You can also help a lot by leaving us a positive review for others to see. This podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many other audio content delivery apps. Thank you and God bless.